The sky above the city was turning that deep, dark shade of blue that happens right before the streetlights fully take over. It was cold, the kind of cold that doesn't just sit on your skin but seems to reach inside your coat and grab hold of your bones. Elena, though, didn't mind the cold too much. It helped keep her awake. She stood on the busy sidewalk, clutching the worn case of her cello. The case was heavy, dragging her shoulder down a little, but she treated it like it was made of glass. Inside was her best friend, her voice, and the only thing she had left in the world that truly belonged to her. Her stomach gave a loud, angry growl. She pressed her free hand against her belly, trying to quiet the noise, but it was no use. She hadn't eaten since the morning before, and that had been just a small, bruised apple she found near a market bin. The hunger was a sharp pain now, making her head feel light and her hands shake slightly. She needed food. She didn't need money for rent or bills. She had lost her small apartment weeks ago and was sleeping in a shelter that smelled of bleach and old socks. She just needed a hot meal. Something solid to stop the shaking. Across the street, the warm glow of a restaurant spilled out onto the pavement. It was a nice place, not fancy, but clean and welcoming. Through the large glass windows, she could see people sitting at wooden tables, laughing and eating. They had plates of pasta, steaks, and baskets of bread. Just looking at the bread made Elena's mouth water. A small sign near the door read "Live music tonight." Elena took a deep breath. She adjusted her scarf to hide the fact that her hair hadn't been washed in 3 days and checked her reflection in a shop window. She looked tired, pale, and thin, but she tried to stand up straight. She had been a good student once. She knew how to play. She had played in recitals and school halls before her life fell apart. She knew she was good enough. She stepped off the curb, dodging a taxi that honked at her, and walked toward the entrance. The glass door was heavy, but she pulled it open. A wave of heat hit her face, smelling like garlic, butter, and roasted coffee. It was the best smell she had ever encountered. For a second, she just stood there, letting the warmth soak into her coat. The restaurant was buzzing with conversation and the clinking of silverware. A man in a white apron was walking between tables, clearing plates. He looked busy, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. Elena assumed he was the owner or the manager. He looked like a man who worked hard and didn't have time for nonsense. She walked up to him. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure he could hear it. She clutched the handle of her cello case tighter until her knuckles turned white. "Excuse me," Elena said. Her voice came out raspy and quiet, much smaller than she intended. The man stopped and turned around. He looked her up and down, taking in her old boots, the thin coat, and the large instrument case. He didn't look angry, just tired and in a rush. "Yeah, what can I do for you?" he asked, glancing at a table that was waving for his attention. I saw the sign," Elena stammered, pointing a trembling finger toward the window. "I play music. The cello. I was wondering if I could play for you tonight. For your guests." The man sighed, looking at the clock on the wall. "Look, miss. We already have a guy coming in. A guitarist. He'll be here in 20 minutes. I don't need any other acts." "Oh, I know," Elena said quickly, feeling a flush of embarrassment heat up her cheeks. "I don't want money. I don't need a gig. I just..." She paused, hating that she had to say it out loud. "I haven't eaten today. I was hoping I could play a few songs, and maybe you could give me a plate of something, anything. Pasta bread." The words hung in the air between them. The silence seemed to stretch out, even though the restaurant was still noisy. The man's face softened a little, but he still looked uncomfortable. He didn't know what to make of her. Before he could answer, a young couple sitting at the table nearest to the door stopped eating. The man had a loud, sharp laugh that cut through Elena's confidence like a knife. He had overheard her. He nudged his girlfriend and pointed at Elena with his fork. "Did you hear that?" he chuckled, not even trying to lower his voice. "She wants to play for dinner." "What is this, a fairy tale?" The woman giggled behind her napkin, looking at Elena with a mix of pity and amusement. "Maybe she should go to the circus," she whispered loudly. The laughter felt like a physical slap. Elena felt her face burn hot. She shrank back inside her coat, wishing the floor would open up and swallow her. The manager looked at the couple, then back at Elena. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking awkward. He didn't tell the couple to be quiet. Instead, he just shook his head at Elena. "Look, I'm sorry," he said, his voice low but firm. "I can't just give away free food. And I can't have you disturbing the customers. We have a business to run. It's nothing personal." "I'm good," Elena whispered, tears stinging the corners of her eyes. "I promise I'm good." "I'm sure you are," the man said, turning away to pick up some empty glasses. "But I can't help you. You should probably go." Elena stood there for a second longer. The smell of the food was torture now. It wasn't comforting, it was just a reminder of what she couldn't have. She could hear the couple at the table still snickering. The man was making jokes about street performers. She tightened her grip on her cello case. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to tell them she was a human being who used to have a life just like them. But she didn't have the energy. She was too hungry to be angry. She was just empty. She turned and pushed the heavy glass door open. The cold air rushed in, hitting her face and cooling her burning skin, but it didn't make her feel better. She stepped back out onto the sidewalk. The contrast was jarring. Inside, it was yellow and warm and full of laughter. Outside, it was gray and cold and indifferent. She walked away from the light of the restaurant. She didn't want to stand near them anymore. She didn't want them to look out the window and see her failing. She needed to find a spot where she could just be invisible for a while. She walked for a few blocks, her boots hurting on the uneven pavement. The city was getting louder as the night went on. Car horns blared, sirens wailed in the distance, and groups of people hurried past her, bundled up in their heavy coats, heading to bars or homes. Nobody looked at her. She was just part of the scenery, a shadow moving against the brick walls. Finally, she found a spot that seemed okay. It was a little alcove between a closed shoe store and a pharmacy. It was darker here, away from the bright streetlights, and there was a small awning that offered a tiny bit of protection from the wind. Elena leaned against the brick wall and slid down until she was sitting on her cello case. It wasn't comfortable, but it kept the instrument off the cold ground. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around her legs to conserve heat. Her stomach was cramping now, the pain sharp and rhythmic. She thought about going to the shelter. They served soup at 9, but it was a long walk, and the line was always long. If she got there too late, the food would run out. Besides, she hated the feeling of standing in that line, with everyone looking tired and defeated, just waiting for a handout. She wanted to earn her meal. She wanted to trade something of value for what she needed. That was how the world was supposed to work, wasn't it? But the world hadn't been working that way for her lately. She rested her forehead on her knees. The laughter of the man in the restaurant kept playing in her head. Play for dinner. A fairy tale. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was foolish to think her music was worth anything. If she was really that good, she wouldn't be sitting on a sidewalk in the cold. A single tear escaped, running down her cheek and dripping onto her worn coat. She wiped it away roughly with her sleeve. Crying wouldn't help. Crying just made you thirsty. She took a deep breath of the freezing air and let it out slowly. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit here and freeze. She opened the cello case. The instrument lay there, shining in the dim light. It was beautiful, even with the scratches on the varnish. She ran her fingers over the strings. They felt cold, like ice. Elena stood up. Her legs were stiff, and she felt a little dizzy from the hunger, but she forced herself to stand tall. She wasn't going to play for the people in the restaurant. They didn't want to hear her. She wasn't going to play for coins to throw in a fountain. She was going to play because it was the only thing she could do. She was going to play for herself, to prove that the laughter didn't matter. She pulled the bow out of the pocket. It needed a little more rosin, but she didn't have any. She would just have to press harder. She tightened the hair of the bow, turning the screw at the end until it felt right. She looked around. There was no audience here. Just a few stray pigeons hopping around near a trash can and a cat watching her from a dumpster across the alley. This was better. No one to judge. No one to laugh. She positioned the cello between her knees, feeling the familiar weight of it against her chest. It was an anchor. It grounded her. She closed her eyes for a moment, blocking out the city lights, blocking out the cold, blocking out the memory of the restaurant. She took a breath that smelled of exhaust and cold metal, and she let the music come into her mind first. She didn't think about notes on a page. She thought about the hunger, the cold, the loneliness, and the tiny, stubborn spark of hope she still had left inside. She wasn't asking for permission anymore. She was just going to play. The wind picked up, whistling through the narrow gap between the brick buildings. It was a biting, mean wind that found every weak spot in her coat, slipping through the collar and chilling the skin on her neck. Elora shivered, gripping the neck of the cello tighter. The instrument felt like an extension of her body now, heavy and solid, while the rest of her felt light and fragile, like she might blow away into the dark sky if she let go. She looked down at her hands. Her fingers were red and numb from the cold. The tips were rough and calloused, which usually helped her play, but tonight they felt like frozen sausages. She flexed them a few times, trying to get the blood moving, but it was a losing battle. The temperature was dropping fast as the night deepened. Overhead, the clouds were thick and low, blocking out the stars and the moon, leaving the city in a gloomy, artificial twilight. Elora stood alone in the alcove. It was a forgotten corner of the street, far away from the warm, inviting lights of the restaurant she had left behind. Here, the street lights were flickering and dim. The pavement was gritty, stained with old gum and patches of oil. It wasn't a stage, it was just a place where people walked fast to get to somewhere else. She thought about the shelter again. It was a tempting thought. If she left now and walked quickly, she might make it before the soup ran out. She could get a warm bed for the night, maybe a shower, and a hot meal that didn't require her to humiliate herself. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. But her feet felt like they were glued to the concrete. She couldn't move. Not yet. She remembered the sound of the man's laugh. It wasn't just that he had said no, it was the way he had said it. He hadn't even considered her music. He had only seen a beggar with a big box. That dismissal stung more than the hunger. It made her feel small, like her talent, her years of practice, and her passion were worthless. Ilora wasn't doing this for him anymore. She wasn't doing it for the people rushing past with their heads down. She was doing it to prove that she still existed. That she wasn't just a shadow on the wall. She lifted the bow. The rosin on the hairs was old and worn, leaving a gray dust on her thumb. She hoped it would be enough to make the strings speak. She drew the bow across the C string, testing it. A low, rumbling sound emerged, rough and scratchy at first. It sounded like a groan. She shook her head. That wouldn't do. She adjusted her grip. She closed her eyes and took a long, slow breath, ignoring the smell of the trash cans nearby and the exhaust fumes from the passing cars. She cleared her mind of the cold, the hunger, and the embarrassment. She let her shoulder drop, relaxing the tension in her arm. She remembered the feeling of the sun on her face during summer recitals, the smell of polished wood in a practice room, and the pride she felt when she finally mastered a difficult passage. When she opened her eyes again, she wasn't looking at the dirty alley. She was looking inward, finding that quiet place inside her where the music lived. She started to play. She didn't choose a happy tune. She didn't choose a fast, exciting song to grab attention. She chose a simple, slow melody. It was a folk song she remembered hearing as a child, a song that felt like a lullaby for the lonely. Her bow moved slowly, pulling a deep, rich sound from the instrument. The first few notes were hesitant. They felt brittle in the cold air, shattering like glass against the brick walls. But as she continued, the wood of the cello began to warm up from the friction of the strings. The sound changed. It became fuller, rounder, and warmer. The vibration traveled through her collarbone and into her chest, beating in time with her heart. Ilora swayed slightly, lost in the rhythm. The melody was sad, but it wasn't hopeless. It was a sad that understood pain. It was a sound that said, I know you are hurting, but you are still here. A group of teenagers walked by, their sneakers scuffing loudly against the pavement. They were laughing and shouting, carrying cups of soda. For a moment, Ilora thought they would mock her. She braced herself, tightening her fingers on the bow, ready to stop. But as they passed the alcove, the noise faded. One of them stopped mid-sentence. They slowed their walking, looking over at her. They didn't say anything. They didn't throw coins or point. They just stopped and listened for a moment, surprised by the sound coming from the ragged girl in the shadows. Then, realizing they were intruding, they quietly walked away, their conversation lowered to a whisper. Ilora didn't notice them leave. She was inside the song now. She moved to the A string, lifting the melody higher. The sound floated upward, spiraling toward the dark sky. It was a pure, clear tone that seemed to cut through the noise of the city. It felt like she was weaving a spell, creating a bubble of peace around her. The physical world began to fade away. The biting cold wind still nipped at her nose, and her toes were numb inside her boots, but the music acted like a fire. It gave her a strange, burning energy. She forgot about her grumbling stomach. She forgot about the harsh words of the restaurant manager. All that existed was the next note, and the breath after that. She was playing for herself, yes, but she was also playing for the invisible people. She played for the homeless man she had seen sleeping on a grate earlier. She played for the tired waitress who looked like she wanted to cry. She played for anyone who had ever been told no when they needed a yes. Her fingers, stiff and clumsy just moments ago, were moving with a fluid grace she hadn't felt in months. They danced across the fingerboard, finding the positions perfectly. It was as if the cello was guiding her, whispering to her, telling her that everything was going to be okay. She transitioned into a movement that was more complex. The notes became faster, a stream of running water. The intensity grew. The sadness turned into something stronger, a determination. She wasn't begging anymore. She was declaring. She was saying, I am here, and I have something to give. The sound bounced off the pharmacy window and the brick wall of the shoe store, filling the little alcove. It was loud, much louder than she expected. In the quiet of the side street, it echoed, booming like a thunderclap in the silence. She poured everything she had into the music. She poured in her fear of the coming winter, her worry about where she would sleep tomorrow, and her anger at the couple who had left. She turned all those dark feelings into beauty. It was a transformation. It was magic. As she hit a high, sustained note, holding it until her breath ran out, she felt a sudden release. A tear rolled down her cheek, hot and fast, but she didn't wipe it away. She let it fall. It wasn't a tear of sadness anymore. It was a release. She had played the note perfectly. The sound slowly faded, disappearing into the night air, leaving a ringing silence behind. Ilora stood there, her chest heaving, her bow resting on the strings. She felt empty, but in a good way. She felt lighter, as if she had taken a heavy rock out of her chest and thrown it far away. She looked at her hands. They weren't shaking anymore. They were steady. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a failure. She didn't feel like a homeless person asking for scraps. She felt like a musician. She had taken the worst moment of her day and turned it into something that sounded like a prayer. Ilora let out a long breath, watching it turn into a white mist in the frigid air. She adjusted the cello, ready to play again. She didn't care if no one heard. She didn't care if she didn't get a single cent. She had found her voice again, and as long as she had that, she could survive the night. She lifted the bow, her eyes closing in anticipation of the next melody, ready to speak to the dark world once more. The silence that followed the end of the song was not empty. It felt heavy, pressed against her ears like the air before a thunderstorm, even though the sky was just a dull, clouded gray above. Ilora stood there, the bow hovering just above the strings, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her fingers felt hot now, tingling with the rush of blood, no longer frozen into claws. The wood of the instrument against her chest was the only warm thing in the world. She hadn't planned what to play next. Usually, when she played on the street, she had a set list in her head, fast, recognizable songs that people could hum along to, things that made them stop and drop a coin before moving on. But tonight was different. There was no hat out for coins. There was no strategy for tips. There was only the feeling in her gut and the vibration of the strings under her chin. She didn't want to play a happy song. A happy song would be a lie. A happy song would sound fake in this dark, cold alleyway where the trash bags were piled high and the stray cats fought over scraps. Her eyes remained closed. She let her breathing slow down. She listened to the city. Far away, a siren wailed, a lonely sound that faded into nothing. Closer by, a car engine coughed and died. The world sounded tired. The world sounded like it needed a lullaby, but not a gentle one. It needed something strong. Ilora shifted her grip on the neck of the cello. She positioned her fingers on the G string. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the cold night air, and then she let the bow fall. She didn't start soft. She didn't sneak into the note. She attacked it, but with a sorrow that was huge and overwhelming. The note that came out was a low, deep growl that seemed to shake the bricks of the buildings around her. It was a sound so full of grief that it felt like it had been waiting inside the wood of the cello for 100 years to be let out. This wasn't a folk song anymore. This was something older. It was a sound of loss, of losing a home, of losing a family, of standing on the edge of nowhere and looking into the dark. The note hung in the air, vibrating through the soles of her boots, through the concrete, and out into the street. Then, she began to move. The bow slid across the strings, pulling out a melody that was achingly beautiful. It was slow, dragging like feet walking through deep snow. Every note was bent, twisting with emotion. It sounded like a human voice crying out, asking why things had to be so hard. Ilora felt a lump form in her throat, but she didn't stop. She let the music take her. She wasn't thinking about the notes or the rhythm. She was thinking about the empty room she used to live in. She was thinking about the silence of a phone that never rang. She was thinking about the taste of stale bread and the feeling of a thin blanket that wasn't enough to keep the chill away. The music swelled. She moved from the low G string up to the D string, then the A. The pitch rose, becoming more piercing, more desperate. The sound cut through the damp air of the alley. It drifted past the dark windows of the shoe store and the locked pharmacy. A young man was walking down the street, his head down, typing furiously on his phone. He was wearing expensive headphones, listening to loud, thumping music. But as he passed the mouth of the alley, the sound of Ilora's cello seemed to slip right through the noise-canceling headphones. It was a physical thing, a wave of sound that hit him in the chest. He stopped walking. He pulled off his headphones and looked around, confused. He couldn't see anyone in the dark, but he could hear the sound. It was sad and terrifying and beautiful all at once. He stood there, the glow of his phone screen lighting up his face, and just listened. Inside the restaurant, the jazz band was packing up. The piano player was closing the lid, and the drummer was putting his sticks in a bag. The room was filled with the chatter of people finishing their meals, the noise of plates being stacked, and the hum of the refrigerator. Then, the sound came through the open vent near the floor. It was that first deep, mournful note Ilora had played. The piano player froze. He had one hand on the lid of the piano. He tilted his head to the side. "Wait," he whispered. The drummer stopped what he was doing. "Do you hear that?" The note stretched out, long and trembling. It wasn't the sound of a stereo or a recording. It was too raw, too imperfect. It was the sound of a person holding a heavy weight. The manager of the restaurant, a man named Robert who was busy counting money at the register, looked up. He heard it too. It was faint, coming from the street outside, but it cut through the noise of the kitchen. He felt a strange shiver go down his back. It sounded like the music he heard in his dreams when he was worried about money, lonely and haunting. Back in the alley, Ilora was lost in a trance. She didn't know she was being heard. She was just playing to keep the ghosts away. She moved the bow faster, the rhythm becoming more intense. It wasn't a frantic speed, it was a heavy, pounding rhythm, like a heartbeat under stress. Her left hand moved up the fingerboard, finding the high positions. She played a series of notes that were high and piercing, like a seagull crying over the ocean. The sound was clear and bright, a stark contrast to the dark, heavy low notes she had played before. It sounded like a ray of moonlight breaking through a storm cloud. The physical effort was intense, her arms were burning. Her shoulder ached where the cello pressed against it. But she welcomed the pain. The pain meant she was alive. The pain meant she could feel something other than hunger. She poured every ounce of her remaining energy into the instrument. She thought about the couple who had left. She imagined them hearing this music. Would they laugh now? She didn't think so. You couldn't laugh at this sound. It was too serious. It was too real. It was the sound of the human soul laid bare. The music reached a peak, a high, trembling note that Ilora held with all her strength. She vibrated her hand on the string, making the note waver and cry. The sound spiraled up into the night, swirling around the streetlights, reaching up toward the heavy clouds. It felt like she was shouting without using her voice. She held the note until her lungs were empty, until her arms shook uncontrollably. And then, slowly, she relaxed the pressure of the bow. The volume dropped, fading away like a tide going out. She brought the melody down, lower and lower, until she was back on the deep G string, playing a slow, soft sequence of final chords. The last chord she played was a dissonance, a clash of notes that didn't resolve perfectly. It left the listener hanging, waiting for an ending that didn't come. It was the sound of uncertainty. It was the sound of a question with no answer. She lifted the bow off the strings. The silence rushed back in, but it was a different silence now. The air seemed to be vibrating. The echoes of the cello were still bouncing off the brick walls, fading slowly into the distance. The city felt quieter, as if the buildings and the streets were holding their breath out of respect. Ilora stood very still. Her eyes opened. She looked at the dark wall in front of her, seeing nothing. She felt drained, completely empty, but also strange. She felt lighter, as if she had taken a heavy rock out of her chest and thrown it into the music. She could hear her own heartbeat thudding in her ears. She could feel the cold air stinging the sweat on her forehead. She lowered the cello, letting the neck rest against her leg. Her left hand was cramping, her fingers curled into a claw shape. She had to gently force them open, shaking her hand to get the blood flowing again. She felt dizzy. The rush of playing, combined with the lack of food, made her sway a little on her feet. She reached out and steadied herself against the rough brick of the wall. For a moment, she felt a wave of panic. What had she just done? She had played her heart out in a dirty alleyway. She had poured her soul into the dark, and nobody had seen her. She was still hungry. She was still cold. She was still alone. But then, she looked down at her instrument. The wood seemed to be glowing faintly in the dim light. It felt warm. It felt alive. And she knew, deep down, that something had changed. She hadn't just made noise. She had made something true. She took a shaky breath and wiped her nose with the back of her sleeve. She wasn't ready to play again yet. She needed a moment to just be. She stood in the shadows, listening to the fading echoes of her own song, waiting for the world to start moving again. Inside the restaurant, the air was thick with the smell of roasted garlic and fresh coffee, but the mood at the tables had shifted. The clinking of silverware had slowed down. Conversations that were once loud and animated had dropped to a hush. People were looking up from their plates, looking around at each other with confused expressions, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. It wasn't the usual background noise they were used to. It wasn't the recorded pop songs that played in the grocery store or the traffic outside. This sound had a heartbeat. It was raw and alive, and it was cutting through the insulated walls of the restaurant as if they were made of paper. Robert, the manager, stood behind the counter with his hands resting on the polished wood. He felt stuck. He had been about to count the cash drawer, a task he did every night at this time, but he couldn't focus. The music had a hold on him. It was the saddest thing he had ever heard, but it wasn't making him sad in a bad way. It was making him feel understood. He looked toward the back of the room where the small jazz trio was packing up. The piano player, an older man with gray hair and kind eyes, was also standing still. He wasn't putting his sheet music into his bag. He was staring at the ventilation grate on the floor near the service entrance. That was where the sound was drifting in. "Robert," the piano player said softly. The manager looked over. "Do you hear that?" Robert nodded. He walked out from behind the counter. "Yeah. I hear it." "Is that a recording?" The piano player shook his head. He walked over to the vent and knelt down, listening closely. "No. It's coming from outside. It's live. You can hear the mistakes, the breath in the sound. Whoever is playing, they are pouring their whole life into it. That's not something you can fake on a record." Robert frowned. He walked to the service door. It was a metal door with a small, rectangular window reinforced with wire mesh. He put his hand on the handle. It was locked. For a second, he hesitated. He was responsible for the restaurant. He had customers to take care of. He had a business to run. Opening the door to go investigate a strange noise on a cold night wasn't in his job description. But then the music swelled. It rose to a high, piercing note that made the hair on Robert's arm stand up. It sounded like a cry for help wrapped in a melody. He remembered the young woman from earlier, the one with the big instrument case. He remembered her red face and her trembling hands when she asked for food. He looked back at the dining room. The couple who had laughed earlier, the man in the expensive suit and the woman with the perfect hair, were sitting quietly now. The man had stopped eating. He was staring at his plate, looking uncomfortable. The woman wasn't giggling anymore. She was looking toward the door, her brows furrowed together. The music seemed to have taken the air out of their arrogance. Robert made a decision. He turned the heavy latch on the service door and pushed it open. A rush of cold air hit him instantly, making his eyes water. But along with the cold came the sound, much louder now. It was crystal clear. It didn't sound like a street performance. It sounded like a concert hall. He stepped out onto the loading dock, the concrete cold under his shoes, and looked around. The alleyway was dark. There was a single, flickering yellow light above a doorway down the way, and that was where he saw the shadow. He walked toward it, his boots crunching on the gravel. As he got closer, he saw her. She was standing in the narrow alcove between the pharmacy and the closed shoe store. She was swaying gently, her eyes closed, lost in a world of her own. Her coat was thin, her hair was messy, and she looked incredibly frail against the brick wall. But she was holding the cello with the strength of a giant. Robert stopped a few feet away. He didn't want to startle her. He just wanted to listen. The piece she was playing was coming to an end. The notes were getting slower, heavier, sinking into the ground. She played a final chord that didn't resolve, a sound that hung in the air like a question. And then, she lifted her bow, and the music stopped. The silence that followed was heavy. Robert held his breath. He saw the girl's shoulders drop. She looked exhausted, like a runner who had just finished a marathon with no water. She lowered the instrument and opened her eyes. When she saw Robert standing there, she flinched. She took a step back, pressing herself against the wall. Her eyes went wide with fear. She probably thought he was coming to yell at her. She probably thought he was going to call the police or tell her to move along. "It's okay," Robert said quickly, holding his hands up to show he wasn't a threat. "I'm not going to hurt you." Elora didn't say anything. She gripped the neck of her cello, ready to run if she had to. But her legs were shaking so badly, Robert didn't know if she could run even if she wanted to. "I work next door," Robert said, pointing his thumb over his shoulder toward the restaurant. "At the bistro. We heard you inside." Elora felt her face burn with shame. She had been trying to be quiet. She didn't want to cause trouble. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse. "I didn't mean to disturb anyone. I'll go." She started to pack up the bow, her hands fumbling in her haste. "No, wait," Robert said. He took a step closer. "You didn't disturb us. You stopped us." The whole place went quiet to listen. Elora paused. She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of mockery. She expected him to laugh, to tell her she was crazy for thinking she was good. But his expression was serious. He looked impressed. "You play like you've got nothing left to lose," Robert said softly. "And because of that, you have everything to give." Elora felt a lump form in her throat, so big she couldn't swallow. She blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. She wasn't used to kindness. She was used to being ignored, or being told to get out of the way. "Thank you," she managed to squeak out. Robert looked at her thin coat, at the way she was shivering violently now that she wasn't moving anymore. He looked at her worn boots with the holes in the soles. He thought about the plates of food sitting inside his kitchen, the leftovers that would just be thrown away. He felt a pang of guilt in his chest for turning her away earlier. He had judged her by her appearance, just like everyone else did. He hadn't taken the time to listen. He realized that he had made a mistake. He had the power to help her, and he had almost missed the chance. "Listen," Robert said. He cleared his throat, feeling a bit awkward. "I was wrong earlier. About not needing a musician. The crowd inside, they need to hear this. It's not just noise. It's real." Elora looked down at her feet. "I just wanted to eat something," she admitted quietly. "I don't want to be a bother." "You aren't a bother," Robert said firmly. "Come with me." Elora looked up, startled. "What?" "Come inside," he said, gesturing toward the warm light of the restaurant down the alley. "It's freezing out here. We have a prime rib special tonight. And a stove in the kitchen that is still hot. We can find you a corner to sit in." He didn't ask her to play anymore. He didn't make it a condition. He just saw a human being who was hungry and cold, and he decided to do what he should have done an hour ago. "Are you serious?" Elora asked. She couldn't believe it. It felt like a dream. A few minutes ago, she was playing for the rats and the brick wall. Now, the manager was inviting her in. Robert smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Yeah. I'm serious. My mother would kill me if she knew I left a talented girl out in the cold. Come on." He stepped aside and held his arm out, pointing the way toward the restaurant. The light spilled across the alleyway, cutting through the darkness. It looked like a path to a different world. Elora looked at her cello case. She looked at the dark alley behind her, which led to the shelter and the cold streets. Then she looked at Robert, standing there with the door open, waiting for her. For the first time all night, the knot in her stomach loosened. The hunger was still there, gnawing at her, but the panic was gone. She took a shaky breath. She nodded. "Okay," she whispered. She picked up her heavy case and took a step forward, leaving the shadows of the alley and walking toward the light. The walk to the restaurant felt like the longest walk of her life, even though it was only a few dozen yards. The gravel crunched loudly under her boots, echoing in the narrow alley. Ilara's heart was hammering against her ribs, harder than when she was standing in the cold alone. She gripped the handle of her cello case until her knuckles turned white. Every instinct in her body told her to run, to turn back into the darkness where it was safe and predictable, but her feet kept moving, following the warm glow spilling from the open service door. Robert, the manager, walked a few steps ahead. He didn't look back, but he kept the door propped open with his foot, waiting for her. As they stepped inside, the temperature changed instantly. The biting wind vanished, replaced by a wall of heat that smelled like roasted garlic, fresh bread, and coffee. It was a smell so rich it made her head spin. They walked through the bustling kitchen. Chefs in white coats were shouting orders, pans were clanging, and steam was rising from huge pots. A few of the workers paused to look at the girl in the tattered coat carrying the large instrument, but Robert just nodded at them, a signal that she was with him, and they went back to work. He guided her past the stainless steel counters and out into the dining room. The noise in the dining room was different from the kitchen. It was a low, comfortable hum of conversation. The room was full, with candles flickering on every table and soft light reflecting off the polished wine glasses. Robert led her to a small table near the window, tucked away in a corner. It wasn't the best seat in the house, but to Ilara, it looked like a throne. He pulled out the chair for her. She hesitated, suddenly very aware of how dirty her coat was and how dusty her boots were. She didn't want to ruin the nice chair. "It's okay," Robert said gently, reading her hesitation. "Please, sit." Ilara sat down carefully. The chair was cushioned and soft. She felt like she was sinking into a cloud. She placed her cello case gently against the wall beside her, within arm's reach. She couldn't quite bring herself to let go of it completely. "What's your name?" Robert asked, taking a small notepad from his apron pocket. "Ilara," she whispered. "Well, Ilara," Robert said, tearing off the page and handing it to a passing waiter. "Let's get you fed." While they waited, Ilara sat very still. She kept her hands folded in her lap, trying to stop them from shaking. She looked around the room. The couple who had laughed at her earlier were still there. They were seated near the center of the room. The man was cutting a steak, and the woman was sipping a glass of red wine. For a moment, Ilara panicked. She didn't want them to see her. She didn't want to see the look in their eyes again, the mockery. But then, the piano player from the jazz trio walked past the table on his way out. He stopped near Ilara. He was holding his instrument case. He looked down at her and smiled. It wasn't a smile of pity, it was a smile of respect. "You have a beautiful touch," he said quietly. "Don't stop playing, okay?" Ilara nodded, unable to speak. The pianist nodded back and walked out the front door. A few minutes later, Robert returned. He wasn't carrying a small plate. He was carrying a large oval platter. He set it down in front of Ilara, and the smell hit her like a wave. There was a slice of prime rib, thick and juicy, sitting on a bed of mashed potatoes that were swimming in a dark, savory gravy. Next to it was a pile of steamed green beans with butter, and a thick slice of warm, crusty bread. Elora stared at the food. It looked unreal. It looked like something from a magazine. She picked up her fork, but her hand was trembling so badly she almost dropped it. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She took a small bite of the mashed potatoes. The taste was explosive. Creamy, salty, rich. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She swallowed, and the warmth spread through her chest, chasing away the cold that had lived there for so long. She took a bigger bite. Then a bite of the meat. She ate quickly at first, terrified it would be taken away, but as the food hit her stomach, the frantic edge of her hunger began to dull. She slowed down, actually tasting the meal. From across the room, the man in the expensive suit looked up. He saw the girl in the corner eating. He had seen the manager bring her in. He watched her for a moment. He remembered the laugh. It suddenly seemed very hollow, very small. He looked down at his own plate, then back at her. He nudged his girlfriend and whispered something. They both stopped eating for a second. The girl didn't look over at them, but the man signaled the waiter for the check. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. It was kinder now. It was quieter. Robert came back to check on her a little later. Elora had cleaned the plate. There wasn't a single scrap of food left, not even a drop of gravy. She was sitting back in her chair, looking sleepy and flushed. "Was it okay?" Robert asked. "It was perfect," Elora said. Her voice didn't sound raspy anymore. It sounded stronger. "Good," Robert said. He pulled a chair from the empty table next to hers and sat down opposite her. He leaned in, resting his elbows on his knees. "Listen, Elora. We have a spot here on Friday nights. Usually, it's just the background noise. But people really responded to what they heard tonight. I think if you wanted to play, just for an hour or so, people would like it." Elora looked at him. "You want me to play here?" "I want you to play," Robert said. "And I can't pay you a fortune, but I can pay you. And you can eat here whenever you work. A real meal. Not just leftovers." Elora felt a tear slide down her cheek. It was a different kind of tear than before. It wasn't a tear of pain or embarrassment. It was a tear of relief. She looked at her cello case, then back at Robert. "I'd like that," she said. Robert smiled and stood up. "Good. You finish your water. Take your time. There's no rush." Elora sat by the window for a long time. She watched the people walking by outside, wrapped up in their coats, hurrying to get out of the cold. She used to be one of them, rushing past the windows, looking in. Now she was on the inside, looking out. She reached down and touched the wood of her cello case. It was still scratched and worn, but it felt different now. It wasn't just a burden she had to carry. It was her key. It was her way back. The restaurant began to empty out. The tables were cleared. The lights were dimmed slightly. Robert was busy at the register, but every time he looked over, he gave her a nod. Finally, Elora put on her coat. It was still the same thin, old coat, but she didn't feel the cold as much when she stood up. She picked up her cello case and slung the strap over her shoulder. It felt lighter. She walked to the counter to say thank you to Robert. He was counting money, but he stopped when he saw her. "You leaving?" he asked. "Yeah," Elora said. "I need to go. But I'll be back." On Friday. We'll be waiting, Robert said. Ilora pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The night air was still freezing, but it didn't bite her the way it had before. She took a deep breath. It smelled like snow and exhaust fumes, but underneath that, she could still smell the garlic and bread from the restaurant. She started to walk down the street, toward the shelter. She didn't know exactly where she would sleep tomorrow night, and she didn't know how she was going to fix all the problems in her life. There was no magic solution. The road ahead was still going to be hard. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of it. She had her music. She had a full stomach. And she had a place where she was welcome. As she walked, she began to hum a new melody. It was a little bit sad, like the old one, but this time, the notes were lighter. They were lifting up, reaching toward the streetlights. It was a song of hope, small but steady. And under the streetlights, with her head held high, Ilora walked home.